Click to progress or scroll.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name again is Tom Schueler. I've been working in stormwater for about 30 years, and in the workshop over the next couple of days, we're going to go over some of the key practices as part of the watershed implementation plan. We'll be talking about stream buffers and tree planting. We'll be talking about bioretention design, which we talked about this morning, as well as stream restoration. So hopefully we've put together the program to provide as much practical information that we can to, and not a lot of theory and stuff like that. If you have those kind of questions, please feel free to bring them up. Just kind of a show of hands, how many people in the room have experience in bioretention? Okay, great, that's pretty happening. In terms of like my qualifications, we've written quite a few design manuals for many states, state of Maryland, Minnesota, and others. We've been working on perfecting bioretention over the years. So put together some thoughts on it. My own view is while the Pennsylvania Stormwater Manual has some good general design guidance on bioretention, we've learned a lot of things about how to make sure it works, it lasts, and it performs well. So I'm going to go over the tricks of what I've learned, and if there's anything that you feel that you want to contribute and share with your colleagues, feel free to do that. Okay, in terms of the bioretention design specification, what we'll talk about this morning is what's the right recipe for the media, how shallow or deep does the bioretention area have to be, what sort of minimum geometry do we need to accomplish, a little bit about planting lists and what species do the best, how do we protect the area during construction, what kind of setbacks we would have from buildings, foundations, water lines. After our break at 10, we'll talk about construction inspection. We'll also talk about the wide range of landscape templates that we can have. They can have a number of different surface covers. They don't always just have to have mulch. It's a common misconception that a lot of people have. When you get a bit larger, it's important to incorporate pre-treatment practices within the facilities. We'll look at most soils in this region, most bioretention areas will require some kind of underdrain because infiltration rates may not be high enough to support those kind of designs. We'll talk about fabric and not using it between the layers. It's a common problem we've encountered in the state of Maryland where I've done most of my work. And then we'll look at urban design applications for, if you have a downtown area, how do you squeeze bioretention in? And it's a very popular practice in many parts of the Bay watershed when it's kind of tied into streetscaping and those kind of revitalization practices. So we'll talk about some of those. We'll look at rain garden design, which rain garden is just a small bioretention area. We'll look at the design of larger basins. We'll look at dry swales, which are a form of bioretention, just a linear form. We'll talk a little bit about karst, because there's a fair amount of karst in this region. Is that fair to say? And, so we'll talk through that issue. We won't talk about coastal adaptations because we're pretty far away. And we'll talk a little bit about cold weather design. And generally speaking, I'll answer that question right now. One of the beauties of bioretention is that it works in cold climates. Some of the best, the most effective facilities I've ever seen have been located in places like Vermont, Minnesota, I've even seen some from Alaska. So it works probably much better than most other practices in regions that have cold, harsh winters. Okay, so that's kind of the broad scope of the design spec. I think, Cecilia, we put together some resources on the links to resources.
I think we put the Virginia spec up there as a resource.
We'll follow up with those resources online.
We started a collaborative effort 4 years ago to do a bay-wide design specification, and that has since been incorporated in the Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, and District of Columbia stormwater manuals. So we put the bioretention spec from Virginia, I think, on the website. So we'll go through these topics. But starting at its most simple level, bioretention, there's two basic design options. We can either have a situation where it infiltrates through the subsoils and the runoff disappears that way, kind of the infiltration design, or if the soils don't allow for that, we can have an underdrain that's daylighted to some downstream point. The underdrain has perforations, and so it slowly dewaters the facility after the storm. How does it work? Hopefully the animation will do. We have a shallow depression. Runoff flows into the facility and temporarily ponds. Let's see if it works. It fills up. The full ponding depth is used. Then over a period of hours, it drains down. In this case, there you can see the underdrain. But through that simple technique, we store the runoff, we filter it through the soil media, removing pollutants, and we reduce the total volume of runoff that was produced from that storm. So it's a fairly simple system. It's meant to mimic a very permeable forest setting, and it does so quite well. Typical design features, looking in cross-section, you have the ponding depth, it's usually 6 to 12 inches maximum. In some areas, you can maybe go as deep as 18. We'll talk about those choices. Gentle side slopes. And then in cross-section, we have the soil media, a choker layer of sand over 2 inches of choker stone. And then we have the in this case, a sump layer, gravel, which is used to house the underdrain pipes, which are typically 4 to 6 inches in diameter. In this case, there's an additional 12 inches of sump below the bottom of the underdrain. And why do you think that exists? And the researchers realize that even if we can't get infiltration, if the runoff is stored in this gravel sump layer, a good portion of it will gradually infiltrate, even if you have very low infiltration rates. And even if it doesn't, you create an anoxic zone in the bottom, which promotes denitrification, which helps to remove nitrogen, which is very difficult to remove. So that's the basic, simple components of bioretention. The reason why bioretention is the most widely used stormwater practice in the Bay watershed now is that it is incredibly versatile. You can do all sorts of applications. You can put it in parking lot islands. You can have curb cuts. You can have these very urban designs in the streetscape. You can have rain gardens. You can have dry swales. Pretty much it works virtually everywhere. There are a few feasibility requirements I'll go through in a minute. The It can be done on a very small level. The micro applications where individual residential rooftops, here's a drive-in aisle at a fast food restaurant for the commercial rooftop. And so in this case, the drainage area is about 1/20 of an acre, so very small. And when you do that, you want to make sure most of the drainage area is impervious rather than pervious. It can scale up. Here's some examples. I think at 2.5 acres is probably my cutoff point. I forget what the Pennsylvania manual says. But when you get bigger than that, that's where all the problems start. Because bioretention is not a pond. It's not meant to take a whole bunch of concentrated runoff. And when we turn it into a pond, we get a lot of maintenance problems. But here's one treating about 2 acres. Here's the parking lot medians, smaller right-of-way, courtyards. A lot of landscape architects love bioretention because they combine effective stormwater treatment with creative landscape approach. And I think that's great, but we always have to remember that there is a season called winter. So, sometimes. And here are some larger bioretention basins treating institutional, and in this case the bottom of an extended detention pond as a retrofit. And we're seeing a lot more of that in the last couple of years, that people have to retrofit a pond and improve its performance rather than creating a wetland, which some people might not like out of concern for mosquitoes or something like that. They can just dig a little bit deeper and create a bioretention cell in the bottom of the. And then here's some more photos of the application of dry swales, which is just a linear form of bioretention. You can see this is actually from Seattle, Washington. It's coming down a fairly steep street, and they're using these concrete weirs to create essentially the cells in a kind of a staircase progression. It's pretty fancy design. In terms of soil testing, if you want that first option where you're using infiltration, you need to have at least 1 inch per hour of infiltration rates. Essentially, if you have hydrologic soil group A or B on your site, you're always gravitated to those permeable soils as the location for your stormwater treatment facilities, because it's a lot cheaper to infiltrate than underdrain. So that's the key decision. Here's some other, I think I showed this to you before, where we have the sump at the bottom. That's not necessary, but it's a good creative approach. Another design option is what they call the upturned elbow. And the way it works is here's a drop inlet, and then you have the sump layer there, and it creates internal water storage zone. This is probably a better view of how the upturned elbow, so because it's going here, everything from here down will have water most of the growing season. So that way, would have a little caution if you haven't done this too often. It could create, it certainly creates very moist conditions in certain residential applications. I don't think people would want that. But in institutional settings, it's probably a good idea. All right. One of the big changes in our profession in terms of stormwater is we used to just worry about stormwater, but now we really worry about a lot more issues. And one of those is sediment nutrient reduction, because we all have the Bay TMDL, local TMDLs that we need to get real reductions in nitrogen and phosphorus. And I show this slide because it came from a report I did back in 1998, and it shows the removal efficiencies for bioretention for soluble phosphorus were actually found to be negative in the first generation of bioretention, which is like, what? We can't have negative removal. How can you have a negative removal? It should be trapping at least something. But what turned out is the first generation of soil media had a lot of compost and organic matter. And so when you think about it, if you run a lot of water through a highly organic matter mix, what's going to come out? You're going to leach the organic matter. So that, when we tell the history of bioretention, we've learned, we've had to change our game a number of times. In terms of the different removal mechanisms, for sediment and phosphorus removal, it's primarily done through sedimentation and filtering through the media. For sediment, we typically get at least 50 to 75%, which is a good number. Phosphorus removal is 25 to 50%. That's a pretty reliable number. There is that first month or two, if you put a monitor out there, it may temporarily increase phosphorus for the first few summers. But, and how did we solve the problem of negative phosphorus removal? Well, we shifted to a media that didn't have much organic matter. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but it's now about 85% sand, whereas in the earlier generation it was only about 50% sand. Nitrogen is a very hard pollutant to remove because a lot of it exists in soluble form. And soluble forms like nitrate require a process known as denitrification. And denitrification only occurs where we have anoxic zones next to areas with oxygen, and then organic carbon and the presence of these bacteria. And when they're together, the denitrification can be pretty good. So we can get up to 40 to 60% in the field studies. Here's another example of that upturned elbow, which was pioneered by North Carolina State University. If you ever want to read all the research studies, North Carolina State has probably done the most original work. Most removal rates, we'll talk about media depth a little bit later, minimum and maximum, but the research clearly shows the deeper we make it, the greater the removal rate will be. So there's a clear linkage between the depth of the filter bed and the removal rate. Bioretention is very good at bacteria removal because the bacteria are filtered through the media and then they get dried out. Bacteria are like vampires. They don't like the light of day. And so if we get them dried out, they die off, particularly on the surface, but also in the sand media. So we've seen upwards of 70 to 90% removal of bacteria, which is a very good number. So what else do we have? Metals removal. I was like showing the slide, and I just imagine this teenager going, "Hey Mom, I wrecked the family car on a rain garden." But it's also one of those things you have to think about when you're doing your own design of, okay, I'm putting, well, let's talk about it. Why is this such a hazardous site for the car? Yeah, they're just relying on a 3-inch curb, 6-inch curb or something to keep the cars out. But also look at the side slopes. You know, they're really making it deeper and they're creating a more hazardous environment. If this were, you know, somebody walking from here to there, you'd have to have some kind of bridge to get across. So we have to, you know, sometimes as designers, we're just thinking about this blank space on the plan. And we don't think, oh, I'm in this area where people, known as pedestrians, walk around and cars move around and accidents can happen, all that kind of stuff. But getting away from the humor of it, in terms of metal removal, bioretention is very good for lead, copper, and zinc removal rates consistently at the 50 to 75% rate. They do both particulate and soluble. People will often come to you and say, "Hey, am I creating this kind of future landfill site, you know, storing all these pollutants, and that they will one day build up or leach out?" But the studies have shown that they'll stay there. They're locked up for dozens and probably hundreds of years. So that's pretty good. They're also effective at removing hydrocarbons, oil, and grease from runoff, which are very common in parking lots. So that's good news there. So overall, the pollutant removal is pretty solid. And the other nice thing about them is, depending on the depth of the filter layer, they can moderate temperature, particularly when they're deeper. So if I have a trout watershed, and I'm trying to keep those temperatures down so that the trout can survive in the summertime, then bioretention is good. And not only do I want to have a kind of a deep layer, but I also want to have trees and shrubs to shade it and further reduce the temperature. And some people like light-colored mulch. I don't know whether that's... Okay. So that's kind of an overview of the major design applications and the removal efficiency. And so we've learned two things so far: very versatile and very high rates of pollutant removal. So far, so good. Let's talk about some of the design issues that we need to evaluate in every project. And Cecilia referenced the Virginia Bioretention Design specification. It's about 20 pages or so, with all due deference to the fine Pennsylvania Stormwater Manual. This is what I would use instead. It's thoroughly up to date, and most importantly, it has had a lot of eyeballs looking at it. We had over 50 people contribute to the design specification. And I'll tell you a little dirty secret, since I've been involved in a lot of stormwater manuals. That's pretty uncommon. Usually people write a design manual, a couple brave souls, and if they make a mistake, Lord knows I have, it becomes enshrined for the rest of time until the manual is redone again. So that's why I like the design specification. Is there were a lot of it was frustrating that we probably went through 25 drafts, and nobody likes to go through 25 drafts, but in doing so, I think they perfected these things as much as it can be done. Okay, so what are the killers, bioretention killers, in terms of feasibility? Well, they aren't so useful, at least if you have underdrains, if you have extremely flat site. You need a certain amount of head to allow gravity to drive water through the system in the filter medium. So if you have an underdrain, you're counting on about 4 feet of head. The other issue is how far is it to groundwater or bedrock. Typically you want to have a couple of feet of separation distance between the bottom invert of your bioretention area and those layers. I'm assuming in this region groundwater depths are pretty deep, but I'm also assuming that bedrock in some cases can locally be pretty close. So if you have bedrock outcroppings, that might be a sign that another practice might be needed. So those are the 2 biggies. The other one relates to the soil infiltration rate. The only other true killer is if you have a really wet site with a spring or some kind of irrigation that's sending water on a full-time basis to it. That doesn't work. You want to create something like a wet swale or a wetland or some other alternative than that. Then the other 2 issues, you have karst topography and stormwater hotspots. And in both cases, there's a risk of groundwater contamination. So in both of those settings, we recommend that they be underdrained, and in some cases have a lining on the bottom of the invert of the bioretention area. That liner is impermeable to keep it from going down gradient and to feed back into the underdrain and daylighting as surface water. And that's a particular concern if you have a lot of karst, because you don't want your bioretention area to become a sinkhole generator. But having said that, a bioretention area is superior to, let's say, a pond or a large centralized facility when it comes to karst topography. We've done a lot of work in the Central Valley of Shenandoah, and they have karst all over the place. And their old ponds have, 20 to 30 mini sinkholes, and constantly have that problem. Whereas a more distributed system of bioretention, while once in a while you're going to lose one, it minimizes that issue. Okay, so the next issue is, do you have enough space available for stormwater treatment? And I use a real simple rule of thumb of 5%. That I look at the contributing drainage area, and if I can get about 5% of that as green open space, that's down gradient of that impervious area, I think it's a logical candidate for bioretention. Subsequent computations might prove me wrong, but it's a good rule of thumb. So like when you're doing concept designs, we were out with Brian this afternoon looking at retrofits. You're kind of looking for at least 5%. If you got 10%, you feel like you just came out of a casino. So here's just some slides showing that sense of here's like a huge parking lot going to too small of a bioretention area. And that's kind of, sorry guys, too small. Here's one, what was it, the 3 little bears? So that was
Goldilocks.
Goldilocks and the 3 bears, that's right. It's been a while since I've had children. Here's a case where it's And this was not taken in the state of Pennsylvania, by the way. This is our West Virginia fence. So this is a bioretention area where they put it on too great a scale. And I made that point earlier about, when you get big drainage areas to bioretention, it's like banks. They're going to fail, and they're going to fail big. And this one is a spectacular fail. It's like a sea of wet mulch with like 4 little boxwoods in the background. And they've never been able to fix this one. So they just ended up converting it into a wetland. So you want to get it just right in the middle. So again, here's a real ideal thing. And why do I consider this an ideal application? Well, it meets all of my aesthetic tastes. It has no hard side slopes, right? It's a facility that Joe or Sally can mow on the buffer. If I were a passing resident, I would look at this and go, oh, that's kind of nice. I wouldn't really know it was a stormwater practice, and that in itself is a spectacular result. It just looks like good landscape, and it doesn't look, no obvious erosion, and again, I don't know how the landscaping codes are in this part of Pennsylvania, but it's very common in site design requirement at the local level to require 5 to 10% of commercial areas to be landscaped, right? And so when we go to these new strip malls or big pad developments, we see the crummy landscaping. That'll be your homework for today when you go out of this building to look at the landscaping that was expensively put together. Looks like garbage. It does not provide much stormwater. Where we can use that landscaping area for bioretention, we're getting function with aesthetics at the same time. Okay, I'm not going to do any design computations today because it's rude to do that so early in the morning. But in terms of treatment volume, whatever you have to treat, and in a retrofit setting, it's as much as you can get away with. So if I can get a 1/2 inch or 1 inch of treatment volume over the contributing area, I consider that a victory. Now, if it's a new development, I have to treat more based on the infiltration requirement. But a lot of people are looking, how do you compute how much treatment volume you've achieved? The old way was just to look at the ponding depth above the bioretention area, so from here to here. So let's say it's 1 foot by 4 feet by 20 feet. So you run the calculations, and that would be the volume of treatment. But over time, designers, being the great, clever people that they are, they found a number of tricks to get more storage. So basically, they compute the depth of the filter, and because there's void space in between, there's a lot of sand, you can take that volume, multiply it by 0.25, and that's the water stored in the filter bed itself. So you can add that to the treatment volume. And then if you have that under drain or sump layer, there it's got a void ratio of 0.4. So that depth times the length times 0.4 is further treatment volume. And then there's some other tricks. Rather than having the steep side slopes, if you can extend it out beyond the limits of the filter bed and take credit for that within reason. And so there's a lot of ways you can start getting a lot of treatment volume in ponding areas over time. And the same rules apply for water quality swales. It's just like there's a series of check dams going down slope, and you compute the volume for each one added up at the end, and it usually works out quite well. So that's a consideration of treatment volume. And I've shown you so far a lot of pretty pictures of bioretention. Later today, Cecilia is going to show you like the worst pictures of bad bioretention. But it's like any new practice, people are struggling to figure out how to do it right because they overdo it. And so that's why we have a lot of minimum geometry, that you can't make them more than a foot deep. That the bottom has to be flat as a pancake. That there might be a maximum contributing drainage area. And these are my rules. They may not be in the Pennsylvania manual. You want the contributing drainage area, or CDA, to be as 100% impervious as possible. And why is that? Well, when it's not pavement, it's what? Grass. And if it's grass, it usually means it's going to not all take. And so if it's a source of sediment to our bioretention area, that will cause its premature failure. We also want to look at things like, just like we would in a pond, we want to look at things like flow paths and length to width ratios. And I'll show you a few photos of what they look like. So, in general, like anything, we don't want real fat facilities, we want long, skinny ones. So here there's a huge, we're getting a grass channel to go into it, so we're at a very long area. Here's another one where the flow path is probably 300 feet long from inlet to outlet, and so it makes it work. You can also see when we talk about vegetation management that we have to have, we have to think about what the outcome will be 5 or 10 years down the road. And this is only 5 years after this one was built. And they're already way behind thinning and weeding and all that. So it's real important at the outset when you're doing your design and looking at your concepts about what will the landscaping template be and what's a reasonable expectation for maintenance of that biomass. It's something that there's a tendency, and I hate to be critical of my landscape architect friends, but they love to specify 20 different native plants. You know, it looks very beautiful in year 1, looks great in year 2, but over time, what you originally plant, some dies out, some volunteers come, and you just have to, you're really managing for 5 or 10 years from now and not right away. So here's some examples of short flow path with less treatment. And they're all silly, aren't they? And I'll explain their silliness in detail. Here's a curb cut going to a drop inlet. Now, what's the first thing that makes you think that's a bad design? That drop inlet is below the curb cut. So in this case, runoff comes down the grass, goes down the drain hole, and it never fills up. So we spent all this, they spent all this money on soil media and mulch and plants, and it never gets to them. And it was just an issue of 6 inches, but they didn't lay it right. And so we'll talk about construction inspection and later this morning. Here's another one. You have curb cuts. So this last one goes directly in, and all this area here is never used. So again, keep that in mind. Here's another, they spent a lot of money on rock, and again, they got the drop inlet, which is the one that regulates the flow. That's got to be up there so the thing can actually pond, and they got that one wrong. And I used to think at one point there was just 1 or 2 knuckleheads out there that were doing this, but I think what I've realized is most of us are used to ponds. Ponds, there's foot differences, or 5 feet, or 10 feet. Whereas with bioretention, we're looking at 2 inches, 3 inches, 12 inches. And drainage areas that might have a drop of 6 inches from hither to yon. The next question from a design consideration is, what is the allowable surface cover? I mentioned at the outset that there's a misperception that it has to be mulch and then trees. And that indeed was the original design. The researchers have gone out and looked at facilities that have a grass cover, and they work just as well as ones with the mulch cover. And they have one significant savings, which is what? Yeah, I mean, mulch is pretty expensive, and if mulch lasts, what, 2 years, then you have to redo it, maybe 3, depending on how hard to work. So a grass cover is not a sin. In certain other areas, you can see this design is fairly attractive. It has some bioretention plants, but it also has a fair amount of river stone, which I think is attractive. That area, it's an allowable surface cover. The only issues I ever have, if I were to trout stream, I probably would be a little concerned that that design will heat up the runoff. You can imagine a day like today, it's heating up all day, then a thunderstorm comes over the rock, it's going through, that it might increase the temperature. So we've seen, and the other thing about the mulch, there's nothing wrong with the mulch, but the mulch is meant to be a transitional cover, so that at some point it will be all vegetation. So we don't want to have this, for the rest of time we're going to mulch this facility. We want it to grow in so that the plants come up in the spring and it looks fully, the mulch does have some properties where certain metals bond to them, but the same holds true with the soil underneath it. So I just want to make that key point. You have a lot of flexibility about the cover. This is where we want to get to, a good healthy mix of herbaceous and shrubs, and this is what we want to avoid, is just a sea of mulch without the plants. So it may start out looking like this, but we're trying to transition over to that. And that, from an engineering perspective, we're all afraid of plants. Most engineers are very afraid of plants. They don't have a lot of experience, and that's for other people to worry about. So figuring that out is good. The next design issue is, how do you get the water into the bioretention area? And it seems pretty simple, but it gets very complex. This shows a whole series of different options. The one you see the most are curb cuts, and as Cecilia will shock you later this morning, the curb cuts are usually the location of almost all the maintenance problems associated with bioretention, because we're sending it in and it's dropping down and creating a hydraulic jump. This is like the classic design where you have a gravel diaphragm, so that it's coming across the entire edge into the mulch bed. Here's another fancy curb cut, but because they're putting so much water, they had to put some stone to stabilize it. Here's another one where it's going over just a bit of grass. So all the different inlet options have with them some kind of problems later on. But the key issue for inlets of any kind is to not have a lot of drop, have enough drop, and this again is where designers and installers and contractors are constantly making mistakes is looking at this one, this is looking good, right? But over time, what's going to happen? Sediment's going to build up here, right? And so if the sediment is there, it'll hit that and not be able to get into the facility. I think I have a shot of that in a second. Yeah. Here's this wonderful, there's a bioretention area. And what's interesting is they're looking at their, oh, what's wrong with this? All the plants are dying. And then the forensic bioretention guy goes, well, I think I know why. Because this is only a couple years old, but sediment and grass grow up at the lip right there, right? So rather than going into it, it's going around it. So there's a case where there's not enough drop to let gravity drive the system. But on the other hand, if we had like 6 inches of drop, what would happen? You get a storm like we had last night. I have to drive it up 99. I thought I was going to die. You get that rain coming down and one of those really intense thunderstorms. With a 6-inch drop, you create little bio-canyons very quickly. It's amazing what the intensity of a thunderstorm can do. It's a little 6-inch drop. So in between no drop and 6 inches is where there's a sweet spot in the middle in terms of performance and maintenance that we want to do. And what is shown on the plan, they show the sweet spot, but we need to make sure that our contractors thoroughly understand that we want to get in that 3-inch zone. And here's again, that we need a drop and then a flat area so that we don't get the erosion. And again, it's fairly simple in concept, but it's often violated in the field. The next design consideration that I feel is pretty important is pre-treatment. Almost every practice has some form of pre-treatment. I generally feel that bioretention doesn't need it for rain gardens and micro applications. But when you start treating, I'll throw out a ½ an acre or more, I will look at my design and say, can I have some kind of forebay where I'm trapping the material, the sediments, before they get into the main cell. They don't need to be large, they don't need to be deep, they don't need to be concrete. But they're just an area where we're dropping the sediments out where it's easier to maintain. And again, the principle of pre-treatment is we want to control where the sediments drop out because that's where we're going to maintain it. That's where we're going to get our shovels out and remove those sediments. We don't want to have to do it over the entire bed of the bioretention area because that means we have to go back out and get rid of all the plants that we just planted. And how do you scoop out the sediment around all those wonderful flowers? No, you want to do it in one spot rather than the main cell. And grass channels have been used for pre-treatment, grass filter strips, stone flow spreaders, and then this larger one, the stone riprap apron. But one of the things that I really enjoy doing is going out with the maintenance guys and the designers to look at real projects in the field. And engineers love riprap. It's like the easiest solution in the world to an erosion problem is just dump rock on it. It's actually more complicated than that, but riprap is kind of a mission of failure in my book. But on top of that, when you're putting riprap down on a channel at the place where sediment's going to drop out, how the hell do you clean the sediment out? You don't. And so Joe, the maintainer, is looking at you like, what did you do to me? What did I do wrong that I've got to clean out in between the cracks of the sediment? and you can't really look them in the eye. Sorry, buddy. In terms of some of the specs over time, particularly the Virginia spec, it shows some standard details. But then the next consideration is soil media, and as I mentioned, the basic recipe has changed dramatically over time from what it originally was. And it influences not only how we make it, how we install it, but it also influences what kind of plant species can survive well. Because the original media was highly organic, now it's very sandy, so we'll explore that in some detail. So anyway, the objective of that layer is to maintain soil permeability, to get hydraulic conductivity to go through the system with enough fines to absorb pollutants while providing enough organic matter to support the intended vegetation during the initial plant establishment. And because it's a pretty sandy mix, we need just some of it there so that during a windstorm the trees won't blow over if you use trees. So I won't go through the entire recipe. But it's a loamy coarse sand, no more, 75% coarse silica-based sand, just a small amount of organic on a dry weight basis. Average at least 1 to 2 inches per hour. Most of the mixes are probably 8 to 10 inches per hour. You're actually really surprised how seldom modern bioretention areas don't pond. When you see them fully ponded, it's usually a sign that you have an underlying problem. And things like the cation exchange capacity, but the trick is we want to get away from Elmer and Homer making their own mix at home. We want to have a system where there's suppliers that can meet the specification and deliver it to you at the site for a reasonable price. And it's a challenge because we want consistency in the bioretention media, we really do. But we don't want to turn it into liquid gold. I mean, the state of Delaware has an incredible recipe for bioretention media. It costs like $150 per cubic yard. And you're just going, no, I mean, that's going overboard. You should be able to get the whole, I mean, unless it's just sand and some kind of organic matter and a minor amount of fines. And we don't want to have the supplier tied up with doing 1,000 tests to certify. But this is something that's more like $25, $30 per yard is probably a good cost number to look at. We talked about media depth. Because that stuff is expensive, we want to reduce our cost, right? So we're tending as engineers to say, okay, can I get away with 2 feet? I got away with 2 feet. That's very bad. And there'll be worse ones to come over the course of the next few hours. But no, 2 feet is great, but then don't expect to plant a tree. Don't expect to have a huge amount of root removal. Trees need at least 3 feet for an adequate rooting volume. And but there are places we do a fair amount of work in the tidewater area of Virginia, like Norfolk and Hampton Roads. And the groundwater table there is usually within 4 feet of the surface, sometimes 3. So they're constantly going, okay, I'm doing 18-inch deep filters. And I guess if I have bedrock outcroppings, I would. In terms of pre-made versus mixed on site, here's somebody delivering their mix. The on-site mixing, I've seen so many like Rube Goldberg operations where they're getting a concrete mixer and throwing it in. And I've seen like, you know, okay, one thing of sand, one thing of organic matter, and when you look at the ones that fail, they're usually because Elmer and Louis just didn't get it right. On-site is okay for rain gardens. I've done it on my own rain gardens because there you can use the shuttle method, but not on a big scale. Plus, it bulks you up. So there's a lot of questions when it actually comes, you know, when a contractor says, okay, I've got your design, I'm costing it out, where do I get this mix? There are some, I'm not sure, are there good local suppliers of pre-made mix in Pennsylvania? Great business opportunity for someone in this room to do. So there's some questions about it. It's in terms of the Virginia spec, and I won't go through a lot of them, but one notion is when you're using a rapid flow-through design, like on a foundation planter, at the bottom, it could be constructed in two lifts. The first lift is straight sand. The next lift, going up to the surface, is with the sand and the organic compost. And that's just something that our urban friends have kind of tweaked the recipe to make it work for those really difficult ultra-urban conditions. They're really tough to grow plants because of the heat. Okay. The ninth design consideration that we think is pretty important is to have a level filter bed so that you're utilizing the entire surface for infiltration or filtration. And you see in this case two different designs, and we put smiley faces to help guide you about which ones are better than the other. So why is this one happy? Well, it's rained and the entire bottom of the facility is working. It's evenly distributed. If you have really good ideas, what do you see going on in this one that's not good?
Floating mulch.
You are so good, Cecilia. Floating mulch. Yeah, it's kind of, we talk a lot about mulch, but, you know, that's kind of the hidden secret about bioretention. Put that mulch on there, we pond it, and so it's going to move around over time, which is one of the reasons why I want to transition out of permanent mulch to more vegetation. And so because it's moving around, you know, there's more of a risk that it's going to float and accumulate near your outlet. So, but on the other hand, this is an area where we're not getting the even distribution, and we're getting pockets. It has all sorts of different effects. It means certain areas will be exposed, and the mulch will really move around, will have erosion, and certain plants, certain zones won't be able to maintain any vegetation at all, which is working against what we want to do. The other issue, again, we all learn in engineering pretty much by mistakes, and the original bioretention design spec that somebody else wrote, not me, showed the filter fabric on the bottom. And why is that a problem? It creates what we call a plane of clogging. Even if it's specified as being permeable, it always clogs up. And so if we're expecting it to infiltrate, we can have filter fabric, but just on the sides. So that's why when I showed you that kind of choker layer of the stone and sand, and then the media, that substitutes for the filter fabric. But we've been ingrained as designers for probably 30 years that filter fabric is our friend. And we need to have it to separate any two layers of different diameter material. But experience has shown that filter fabric is probably the #1 cause of failure of bioretention areas in the Chesapeake Bay waters. And so here's our another way to make the choker layer: the underdrain stone, and then pea gravel on top of it, and then the media. And that's certainly. Is this the same numbers that you used for stone in Pennsylvania? They're from Virginia.
That's ashtray stuff. We convert ashtray to bedrock.
What about like rubber? I mean, would rubber be bad in a situation like that? Like a rubber at the bottom of it, rather than a filter fabric?
I wouldn't want anything on the bottom of it unless I was in karst terrain or I was worried about contaminating groundwater. And then I would line it, but I would make sure that there was some kind of underdrain so that the facility could dewater.
Okay.
So here again, we have that layer of stone, the pea gravel, and then the media. And you can see the other issue from a construction standpoint is sometimes highway agencies will tell you you have to install it in lifts. So you put, 1 foot down, let it settle, and you get a water truck out and put another foot down. I think that's nonsense myself, because again, we're talking about 80% sand. And so it's not going to settle like topsoil would. In case of topsoil, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to water it so we know what the final elevation is. You can also wait until the next storm and mulch up. The last issue is vegetation, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a very key element of bioretention design that doesn't really get its due, particularly from the design community, because they'll typically just pass it over to the in-house landscape architect to put together a planting plan, which can be horribly expensive. The 4 basic choices that we have are shown in these slides. We can shoot for a rain garden that is what we call kind of a perennial garden. That might have a few shrubs, but it's mostly plants that are pretty low, they're herbaceous. There might be some annuals, there might be some perennials. We kind of self-seed over time, and you might need to mow them at the end of the growing season, and that's basically how they work. The second model is a tree turf setup where we're using turf on the top, which means we have to alter the soil media recipe a little bit to get a bit more organic matter to support that grass. Then we have essentially tree pits interspersed. So from a future maintenance standpoint, this is a facility that I might mow 6-8 times a summer. And I have mulch and stakes, but that's primarily to prevent the mowers from damaging my trees. Here we have a perennial shrub, so it's got more shrubs than that one. And this is the classic tree shrub mulch where we have trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, and mulch. Of the 4, this is probably the most expensive because we're paying for trees, we're paying for shrubs, we're paying for perennials, and we're paying for mulch. And maybe tomorrow and other days, there's a lot of different ways to get these established. I'm a cheapskate, as the city can attest. I like just getting seed mixes, wild wet meadow seed mixes. They cost about $40 a pound, and you can fill in one of these with native plants of this part of Pennsylvania. And they fill in great. They attract pollinators. You mow it at the end of the growing season. Pops right back up next year after the seeds, self-seeds. And it's a wonderful solution. So it's attractive, but it's not, some of these can get so darn ornamental that to keep it in that ornamental state requires perpetual weeding, mulching, and maintenance. And that's fine if that's what you like to do. It's fine for what's in front of City Hall. Put one there. But if it's in the middle of nowhere, you have to be careful of creating unsustainable landscape company. Okay. I'm now going to get away from engineering into the eerie world of landscape architecture. And so anything I say after this point, don't trust me because I'm not very good at it. I have a black thumb as opposed to a green one. But when it comes to picking your plants, a landscape architect will look at the microclimates, will look at the specialty gardens about what you want to achieve. They're looking for functional and decorative elements. They're looking for certain plant characteristics. And something they call all-season interest, so that something is blooming in the spring, the summer, and the fall, so that it provides that benefit. And how you plant, how you place the plants in relation to each other, so it doesn't look like a cornfield. It has kind of a natural feng shui or whatever. Thank you. Like I said, I gave you fair warning. So the first thing you would do is, okay, water zones. Which areas will be saturated all the time and require wet-footed plants, and which areas will have dry-footed plants. And as a general rule, there's a fairly narrow zone where you can expect ponding during every storm event, where we'll have more wet-footed plants than, and as you go further up the side slopes and away from the center, you get plants that are more facultative and upland. And I think the biggest thing that we've learned over time is that our rain gardens are not wetlands. They were initially designed as such, and all the, people would put pickerel weed in them. They put, what's that plant? Not reed today, I have to help me, right?
Not juncus.
Juncus, thank you. Those kind of plants. And some of them will do okay, but only in that one zone, and the rest of them are pretty dry-footed. So something like Joe Pye weed, which you see on a roadside, that does great in a rain garden. But whereas the pickerel weed and things would just dry out. So here's the same concept, looking from over top at the zones. And generally, wherever you have an overflow or an outflow or an underdrain or a low spot, that's where you're going to be the wettest zone. In terms of species selection and planting density, I think I'll leave that for tomorrow's talk, but some of the general rules. This is a wonderful plant and quite colorful as well, but it's a very expensive plant. So again, me, the cheapskate, would just go, okay, broadcast a bunch of wet meadow seed out there and see what springs up. Because these are not gardens, because they're not maintained as such. I mean, they should be, but they tend to go to seed a little bit. And they also are, in the ecology area, there's a lot of research about disturbance areas and invasive plants. And they find that invasive plants are most common where there's a lot of disturbance. And what is a bioretention area than a lot of disturbance? Because you're in a sea of asphalt usually, and so you have a lot of higher temperatures. You have a lot more water coming in. You've got these new soils that are just begging to be colonized by any floating seed in the air. And so you're going to end up over time getting volunteer species, some of which are innocuous, some of which are not, and that will influence. But I did want to show some pretty photos. Here's the obligate wetlands. So these again are the things like swamp milkweed, royal fern, soft rush. These are if you know that you're going to have a very wet bioretention area. And so my own personal rule of thumb is I wait for like 2 months to see what's actually happening in the area before I'm going to buy into these plants. Because they're so obligate wetland that they need to be moist. If it turns out that my bioretention area is pretty more dry-footed than I thought, then those plants will die. And wetland plant nurseries, tend to be fairly expensive. So the facultative one, these are the ones, I love cardinal flower, Joe Pyeweed, golden ragwort, New York ironweed does very well. So that mix of plants does pretty well.
Is that was all wet soil?
Sorry?
So that was all wet soil?
Yeah, basically, what we've done here is, if anyone's ever done any wetland delineation work, you have obligate plant species, facultatively wetland that can exist in wetlands, but also outside of wetlands. So if I'm doing a wetland delineation and I see these, it tells me, it's one of the factors I go into to say, is it jurisdictional wetland or not? And so that's a good way of kind of mapping the wetland world. If I have an obligate and it only occurs within a wetland area, then I know it's going to work well with wet soil. And so transitioning out of there, we have facultative wetland, and we have this facultative, where again, like Joe Pyeweed was in both. Black-eyed Susans, New York asters, these are coneflower. These are things you see roadsides, whatnot. They're not wetland dependent. They do pretty well. And facultatively upland are the ones that prefer dry soils. And they, some examples are shown there. I just showed these pictures because one of the goals with bioretention is to make it an attractive landscape amenity and also a pollinating habitat for butterflies, bees, and so forth. In our urban areas, I think it's a nice thing. So a couple of other thoughts on plant species. If you're not going to use the wet meadow seed mix, and I actually have used a partially shaded seed mix as well, then experiment with 2 to 4 species, maybe 5. What's kind of nice is to, I know with a construction thing, there's this tendency of, okay, I put in the filter media, I put in the mulch, and then I'm going to finish it up, plant all my plants and go. What's kind of, what I've learned with my own rain gardens is that it's kind of an experimental process about what really takes off, what doesn't do well. In fact, if you can increase coverage by separating the plants and replanting them, so you can add over time. And if you're doing a demonstration project for this design competition, you might want to think about staggering your planting over more than one growing season, just to see what works. It's kind of a little experiment about what, if I asked somebody in this room, what are the top 10 bioretention plant species in this, that are native to this part of Pennsylvania, that's what we really want in the minds of all designers in a couple of years. So we have to, we have all sorts of plant lists, but we're still kind of trying to match up the plants to say, okay, they do work really well in your bioretention. The other reason we want to keep it simple is the plan I showed you earlier looked beautiful, but we want to make sure our maintenance crew can identify friend from foe. That is, what is the plant that's supposed to be there versus the plant that's not supposed to be there. And that's an amazing statistic. Someone told me that the average American kid can identify over 200 brands, like, McDonald's Arches or something like that, and then less than 8 native plants. So it's, we don't have, and I have to say, I wish I were better. That's why I got married. My wife is pretty good at that. But there's other reasons too. These are 2 shots that are taken 5 years after construction. We see the 2 dismal trajectories of what we can, the bioretention going back. Here is, a mud pit. And it's such an engineering mentality. I will put them on 6 feet off center. This one was 6 inches off. Redo it. So that's one where we were talking about spacing or planting. That these are not meant to be cornfields, and I would submit to you that they might have more than one species in there. But the other trajectory is this picture of Jerry Garcia. This is from Seattle. I think Cecilia will show it later. It's all steal her laughter, little I can achieve. But this is a Green Street project. So imagine this for a second. This guy's house is here. His car and the street are here. In between. You've ever been out in the Pacific Northwest? And blackberries just grow like crazy. And so the blackberries got in there. And this guy's got to have like a machete to get out to go get his mail. So you have to think about, what will be there 5 years from now. And that's probably the most important thing of all. Okay, a couple of other tips. Usually with bioretention, we want to work fast. We usually can construct them in a week maximum, usually shorter than that. But even during that week's time, they're very vulnerable to failure because of data erosion and sediment control. Some of the tips that we do is if we're using curb cut inlets, we can block them off or just wait till after construction to open them up. It's probably the wisest approach. We can have temporary diversions for the online cells. Those are pretty simple to construct. Rapidly stabilize your side slopes, because these are the most vulnerable areas. And I often find if we're going to go steep, you're going to have problems in the future, but you also want to give it a good start. And that's where some of that, the geotextile fabric, that you use for erosion and sediment control on a steep slope. I would invest a little bit of that. Temporary sheeting, cell construction, and working fast. Keep ahead of raindrops. Construction problems. Well, what do you think went wrong with this one?
Sediment built up under rock.
Yeah, it's you usually for new development you want to put in your bioretention after the site stabilized. Because if the upland area has a lot of sediment, and you've got it there, it's now clogged. What's the problem with this one? I'm actually. I realize I'm giving the answers away. This is like the modern high school. This is a classic case of there's no drop, not by engineering. Is that Laurel? This is a very strong woman. I know her personally, and she's trying to get down. It's just a bad soil mix, and what's interesting is nothing can really grow in it. And then here's a curb cut that's too small, and then there's a little bump. And we always think that pavement is forever on our plans, but it's very subtle, the grades to pavement. And the average paving contractor gets an inch or two tolerance if you're lucky, 6 inches if they're average. And so then over time, here's a case where it's just the wheel ruts. They've created a little diversion channel where nothing's getting in. So those are some typical construction problems. For the maintenance, we'll talk about that quite a bit after the break. But the thing I would say about maintenance is bioretention is cheaper than ponds to maintain. That surprises people when I say that, because I've just described all these things where you have to go out once or twice a year to do a little bit of fixing up. Maybe you have to rake a little bit. The difference is you're doing that with hand tools. You're doing that with landscaping crews. Whereas with ponds, when things go bad, you've got to hire an engineer. When you really have to do big maintenance, you have to get a bush hog. You have to get things like dredging, cleanouts. And so even though you're not doing it very frequently, when you do it, it will cost a fortune. And that's why we have a lot of ponds in Pennsylvania that are not performing, but no one has the money to fix them back up. Because of, the price tag, the homeowners association that has the pond, the municipality that owns it, is looking at a $100,000 price tag, and that money isn't coming off the trees. But in terms of the problems, the Center for Watershed Protection did a pretty big study of 40 bioretention areas that had been in the ground for at least 3 years, I think. And no pre-treatment, inadequate vegetation, short-circuiting, sediment deposition, excessive vegetation. So those are the two states that I showed you in the one slide, bad media and clogging. So the good news is in terms of things that fail big, like having standing water that everyone knows that you failed, is 5 or 10%, and they often coexist. So the reason why we have clogged media is because the media recipe was not good. But most of the sins of bioretention are very easily reversed, and so yes, it's true, and Cecilia will show them, we have some bad bioretention boys out there, but they're a rather small number in total. Okay, in conclusion, I just have a couple slides on design resources in Pennsylvania, which you're probably aware of. I think, and maybe someone can help me out, I've heard persistent rumors that there'll be an update to the Pennsylvania Stormwater Manual. There's a group of lonely, loyal, hard-working people in the private sector that are working on that, have been for years, but I haven't heard about when it will come out. So while, and I don't want to diss Pennsylvania at all, but I really think that Virginia, West Virginia, DC design specs are more useful, particularly if you're doing retrofits. You do have to meet the state standards, but the specs have gotten better. And then one thing I didn't talk a hell of a lot about karst or ultra-urban settings and coastal settings, but we've produced a series of technical bulletins on those topics. They're fairly comprehensive. Again, they were developed in the same way as our bioretention spec by literally 40 or 50 individuals contributed their time and efforts to and experience to make them work. So they're available on our website. A lot of great, how many of you have ever been to our website or are members of the Chesapeake Stormwater Network? Yeah. Only 2 of you. This is like the most exclusive club in America. Your teenager will think you're cool all of a sudden when you tell them, yeah, I'm a member of the Chesapeake Stormwater. So I encourage you to sign up. We offer free webcasts. We have the College of Stormwater Knowledge, a lot of resources on just about anything stormwater to help you.
Free, and I'll only email you twice a month, I promise.
Yeah, and we'll only sell your,
You can sell your information. It's not really good.
shouldn't sell their information to China. We've not yet been breached by Chinese hackers.
Yeah, that's, we can brag about that. Yeah.
All right, so that was kind of a quick tour of bioretention design. Are there any questions or comments or things that I didn't pick up that you all have found in your experience are important? Bioretention? Yeah.
You know, Pennsylvania DEP accepts using the Virginia design specs.
It's kind of something like the Civil War in between the 2 states. But again, my understanding, and I'll confess that sometimes the communication in DEP is inconsistent on these matters. But when it comes to retrofits and your Chesapeake Bay pollutant reduction plans and what you're doing to go forward on that, you have a lot of liberty to use your best professional judgment in compliance. In terms of new development projects, I would size to the Pennsylvania standard and
Well, I think I'm looking more like construction design standards. Pennsylvania's manual, their soil media is no good, what they spec in the manual. I mean, everything you just told us, many of us have experienced as problems because we use Pennsylvania's requirement. The other thing is the geotextile, that's in their design spec.
yeah, that's where, and to make you feel any better, you probably don't feel good, is Maryland had the exact same problem. They had a fine manual in 2000 that had an old outdated spec for bioretention, which I wrote. And in 2007 they did their ESD, the MEP, and the entire bioretention spec is this long. And it shows that damn geotextile fabric on the bottom in the diagram. And so, if you're an engineer in Maryland, you go, okay, this is the new law, and I got to design to this rule, but I'm getting all this failure. And so, it just took them a while to say, okay, we're going to, you need some collusion with your local plan reviewer to make that decision in private practice. You can't be a free agent all the time and do whatever you want. We all realize that. But what's happened is the local plan reviewers have said, okay, we can design it this way. We will accept this. So there's this informal system, and people are shocked that there's this informal systems, but they work, and no one has ever gone, what's the risk that DEP will send you to prison for doing it? Absolutely none. I mean, the chance of seeing someone from DEP in your office is snow in summer. Hopefully no one is here from DEP. I was really just talking about Maryland, my friends. But I think that's the whole issue, though, in a nutshell, is with respect to Maryland and Pennsylvania, we can't treat our design manuals like these tablets that Moses is bringing down from the mountain, this immortality to them. Here's the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not use filter fabric or whatever. They evolve over time, and when Pennsylvania manual is ancient now. first put together. And it's missing at least 3 generations of research and design experience. And so that's why we do what we do at CSN, is we're trying to make a better mousetrap with the realization that the regulatory apparatus is not always going to catch up with us, but we as professionals need to have a little courage, because we're ultimately, when we stamp a plan or sign off and prove it, we want to make sure it's a sustainable practice. Any other comments or questions?
Does anybody in the room know the status of the Pennsylvania Stormwater Management update? I was hoping DEP or somebody would be here to be able to tell us when it's coming out, or what's the status of it, because we don't know.
I might, I mean, I don't know, DEP doesn't know, and that would have been the answer from a conversation with Quigley and Kelly Hafner and other staff, maybe 3 weeks or so ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. There were some meetings that were supposed to be happening, moving forward. It's on Quigley's radar, and now that he's confirmed. But yeah, at that point, they recognized that it had stalled and they didn't have resources for it, blah, 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 but he said it was a priority. So, as soon as I can.
I think the best bet is you might see something by the end of 2015, and I'd probably expect 2015, because we all remember how many years did it take for the first manual. I mean, it was bloodshed for about 4 years. We went through a couple different design consultants.
Yeah, the only positive thing is that some of that bloodshed's been happening sort of behind the scenes for the last couple of years, as you described, people working on.
Any other thoughts or comments or disagreements with what I said? Well, great. I think we can take a break.